Most captives pray for escape. Hugh Glass prayed for a good death. As the Pawnee prepared the sacrificial altar, he had already accepted his fate. His only request to the heavens was for the first arrow to be swift and true. But in a world run by dreams and omens, sometimes the most predictable ending is the one that never happens. He was ready to die, but the universe hadn't finished with him yet. Hugh Glass found himself in a peculiar sort of prison. There were no bars, no chains, and no guards in the traditional sense. After being captured, he was brought to the Pawnee village and treated less like a prisoner and more like a novelty, a strange guest who was free to wander the earthen lodges and observe the rhythm of daily life. For a man who had spent the last 11 years at sea, a period during which Lewis and Clark made their famous trek, this world was more alien than any foreign port. He knew nothing of the Pawnee, had never even heard of the Sioux. He was a blank slate upon which this powerful tribe could write whatever future they chose for him, and that was the most unnerving freedom of all. His guide into this new reality was a woman named Little Feather. She was Sioux by birth, captured in a raid years ago and adopted into the Pawnee tribe, eventually marrying one of its primary warriors, Storm Dancer. She understood what it was to be an outsider. She became Hugh's cultural interpreter, his only bridge to understanding the complex society around him. For weeks he just watched and listened, slowly picking up a single word. Lua. It was a greeting, an offering of food from the chief, Old Knife, a small key unlocking a massive, incomprehensible door. Little Feather helped him learn more, giving names to the stoic faces that watched him with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. There was Big Axe, the imposing warrior, Big Soldier, and the chief's son, Little Knife. It was the story of Little Knife that gave Hugh his first real glimpse into the Pawnee soul. Little Feather told him how, 2 years prior, a Comanche girl was set to be sacrificed to the morning star, a sacred and vital tradition. But Little Knife, in an act of profound defiance, had freed her. He was praised for his courage but also harshly reprimanded for breaking a sacred custom. This wasn't a world of simple good and evil. It was a world of cosmic balance, where a single man's conscience could clash with the perceived will of the gods. The Pawnee, Hugh realized, took their traditions seriously, but they were not unthinking automatons. Their faith had room for contradiction and crisis. This depth was everywhere he looked. He saw boys and men playing lance and hoop, a game that was simultaneously a pastime and a serious economic activity. Boys gambled with arrows, youths with their bows, and men with their prized horses. Everything had a purpose, a sense of order. His respect deepened when Little Feather pointed out a tall, striking individual named Little Wolf. Hugh had assumed she was a woman, but Little Feather explained that Little Wolf was born a man, one of the tribe's greatest warriors. He had received a vision from the Great Spirit commanding him to live as a woman to gain a different kind of wisdom. He had surrendered his male privileges without question, a testament to a faith so profound it could rewrite a person's entire existence. Hugh, a man from a world of hard currency and harder violence, felt a strange admiration. These people lived by a code he was only beginning to understand, a code that made them fearsome to their enemies but generous and orderly among themselves. They called themselves Chahiks, the men of men, and Hugh was starting to agree. As Hugh Glass grew more familiar with the rhythms of the Pawnee village, he began to participate. One afternoon, he was invited to join a game of lance and hoop. His first throw was a clumsy failure, the spear skittering uselessly in the dust, earning some light-hearted jeers. On his second attempt, however, he found his focus, launching the lance with the practiced economy of a man used to throwing harpoons. It sailed true and pierced the rolling hoop, lodging itself nearly a foot through the woven netting. The crowd erupted in cheers, and in that moment of shared victory, he realized the man who had been placing bets against him, the man now smiling with grudging respect, was the formidable warrior, Big Axe. This fragile sense of belonging was later shattered by a story from Little Feather. Her history was a map of the brutality of this land. A Sioux until the age of 15, she was married off to a French trapper named Louis de Lossier. Her initial fear of the white man slowly softened into love as he treated her with a kindness she had never known. They had 2 sons. That life ended in a storm of violence when 4 Osage warriors attacked their camp. Louis and both boys were cut down. In the chaos, Little Feather seized a fallen warrior's lance and drove it through his throat. Just as the others turned on her, the Pawnee warrior Storm Dancer appeared, killing the remaining two Osage. In a state of shock and rage, Little Feather committed the final, terrible act of grief and honor. She scalped all the dead, including her husband and her own children. Storm Dancer, who hated the Osage, took her back to his village. He wanted sons from her, this hardened Sioux survivor, but none ever came. As the time for the Morning Star sacrifice drew near, a new tension settled over the village. Storm Dancer had been gone for a long time on a raid, and his absence was a worrying omen. Hugh's own anxiety grew into a low, constant hum beneath the surface of his daze. Yet his fear was complicated by a deep and growing admiration. He saw the Pawnee not as savage captors, but as a profoundly religious people. They called themselves the Men of Men, astronomers and farmers who believed their covenant with the god Tirawa demanded this sacrifice. It was not an act of malice, but a sacred obligation to ensure the corn would grow and the tribe would survive. Hugh found he preferred these devout warriors to the civilized pirates he had served with, men who killed for greed and boredom. The Pawnee, at least, killed for God. 3 days before the ceremony, the tribe's demeanor toward him shifted dramatically. He was no longer just a guest, he was royalty. He was dressed in beautifully decorated new clothes and served the choicest cuts of meat. It was the 19th century equivalent of being on death row, but with a celebrity chef preparing your final meals. During this period, Little Feather approached him quietly. She pressed a heavy object into his hand. A large, smooth stone of pure red vermilion. She told him to hide it in a leather pouch beneath his loincloth. It was a desperate, last-ditch plan. Hugh accepted it, but he had also accepted his fate. He resolved to walk to the scaffold with courage, to show these people he understood. They bore him no personal ill will. On the final night, the celebratory feast felt more subdued, the drumming heavier. When the time came, Hugh didn't wait to be summoned. He rose and walked out of the lodge on his own, moving toward the ceremonial scaffold erected to face the east. He stripped down to his loincloth and carefully retrieved the hidden red stone. He walked directly to the chief, Old Knife, held out the brilliant vermilion, and spoke loudly for all to hear, declaring it was a gift, a sign from Tirawa himself. A hush fell over the entire tribe. Old Knife took the stone, his face unreadable. He examined it, then turned and addressed his people in a long, powerful speech. When he was finished, he walked back to Hugh, removed the heavy wolf pelt cloak from his own shoulders, and wrapped it around the white man. He pulled him into an embrace. The sacrifice was over. The village exploded into genuine celebration. Hugh was led back to the chief's lodge and feasted with buffalo meat and corn. Old Knife formally gifted him 3 of his own horses. Over the next several hours, Hugh was taken on a tour of 10 different lodges, where he was expected to eat at each one to honor the hosts. 2 days later, Little Feather gave him the final piece of the puzzle. Old Knife, she explained, had adopted him. Years ago, the chief's son and wife had died of a fever. Recently, the chief had a powerful dream where he saw his son grow into a great warrior, who then transformed into a white man, Hugh. This man, sent by Tirawa, was meant to give the Pawnee wisdom for the day the whites would arrive in great numbers. The vermilion stone was the sign Old Knife had been waiting for, the confirmation that his dream was a true prophecy. Hugh was no longer a captive. He was the chief's son. In the 3 months following the ceremony that wasn't, Hugh Glass became a man living between 2 worlds. He was the chief's adopted son, a status that afforded him respect but also scrutiny. He was learning the fluid Pawnee language, his tongue slowly unlearning the hard edges of English and the salty slang of pirates. With Storm Dancer now long overdue and presumed dead, a quiet space began to open around Little Feather, one that Hugh found himself increasingly drawn to. He thought of his old life, of a wife named Sarah and his sons, ghosts from a world he could never return to. Going back to civilization meant facing a hangman's noose for piracy. Here, his future was uncertain, but at least it was a future. He chose to stay. Survival now meant becoming Pawnee in truth, not just in name. The warrior big soldier took it upon himself to be Hugh's instructor, patiently teaching him the deadly arc of a thrown tomahawk. With a wry smile, he'd hint that such skills would be useful for a man looking to protect a wife, his eyes glancing toward Little Feather. Hugh's efforts were clumsy at first, but he was a determined student. Then Big Axe would step in, and with a flick of his wrist, send his own axe spinning through the air to split a sapling 20 yards away, a casual display of mastery that reminded Hugh just how far he had to go. The bubble of his new life was pricked when a trading party of Arikara arrived. Among them was a warrior named Kills the Whites, a man whose name was a mission statement. He stared at Hugh with undisguised hatred, the collection of pale scalps on his belt serving as his brutal resume. It was a stark reminder that beyond this village, he was not the chief's son, he was just another target. Once the Arikara departed, a festive energy swept the village. It was time for the great summer buffalo hunt, the single most important event of the Pawnee year. This was not a small expedition, it was a migration. Hugh watched, fascinated, as the entire village prepared to move. In the large medicine lodge, he witnessed the sacred buffalo dance. For 3 days and nights, priests and chiefs like Yellow Fox and Proud Eagle danced and prayed with relentless intensity, their bodies drenched in sweat, calling upon the spirits to grant them a successful hunt. Then the village emptied. Families packed their belongings onto travois, horse-drawn sleds that carried everything from lodge poles to the elderly and infirm. The column of people and animals stretched for miles. They were soon joined by their allies, the Otos and Omahas, swelling their numbers to a moving city of over 3,500 souls. Hugh learned to ride properly, to feel the horse as an extension of his own body. A warrior named Lucky Hawk explained the rigid rules of the hunt, enforced by appointed horse soldiers who ensured no individual hunter would spook the herd prematurely and ruin the hunt for everyone. It was a massive, disciplined, and sacred operation. After 2 weeks of moving across the plains, traveling 8 to 10 miles a day, and using dried buffalo dung for fuel, the scouts returned. They had found the herd. The sheer scale of it was beyond anything Hugh could have imagined, a dark, moving sea of life that stretched to the horizon. The warriors prepared themselves with smoke and prayer, their energy shifting from a slow march to the coiled tension of a predator. Big Soldier directed the hunters, splitting them into 4 groups to encircle a section of the massive herd. As the riders charged, a thunderous roar filled the air, and a wave of thousands of panicked buffalo stampeded toward Hugh. For a moment, raw terror seized him, but he held his ground, a new primal instinct taking over. The hunters expertly maneuvered the terrified animals, forcing them to run in a tightening circle until they were exhausted, confused, and vulnerable. Then, the killing began. That day, Hugh Glass, the former pirate and adopted son, killed 3 buffalo and truly earned his place among the hunters. The hunt was a masterclass in efficiency. The Pawnee wasted nothing. The hides became robes and shields, the hair was woven into rope, horns were shaped into spoons and cups, and shoulder bones became hoes for their crops. Every man's arrows were fletched and painted with a unique design, a personal signature that made identifying kills simple. By the end of the hunt, Hugh had killed 7 buffalo. He gifted some of the meat to the poorer families and laid a significant portion at Little Feather's lodge. She accepted his offering and, in the days that followed, returned the gesture by making him new moccasins and leggings and by working alongside him to prepare pemmican. Their bond, once a quiet understanding, was now a public fact, approved of by the entire village. Back in their permanent village, Hugh continued his warrior training, but he was also haunted. Night after night, he was plagued by nightmares, the most terrifying of which always involved a bear. Seeing his distress, Old Knife and the medicine man, Yellow Fox, led him to a ceremonial lodge. For 3 days, they performed a healing ritual of smoke, chants, and prayer. They told him he was being followed by 2 spirits. One was the angry ghost of a man who had cursed Hugh as he died. The other was the spirit of a great bear from another life. After the ceremony, the nightmares stopped completely. Sometime later, while hunting with Big Axe, they cornered and killed a massive white grizzly. As they stood over the creature, Big Axe gave Hugh a new name, one earned through spiritual trial and physical deed, Ta-Ka-Kur-Uks, White Bear. His final test came not in a dream or on a hunt, but in the dead of night. While standing watch at the edge of the village, he was ambushed by 3 Kanza warriors attempting to steal horses. One lunged with a tomahawk. Hugh sidestepped and drove his knife into the man's ribs. The second Kanza was fumbling to load a rifle. Hugh didn't hesitate. He threw his own tomahawk, sinking it into the man's chest. The third warrior, seeing his comrades fall, leaped onto a horse to escape. Hugh grabbed the fallen Kanza's rifly fine weapon, much better than his own took aim, and fired. The warrior tumbled from the saddle. By the time other Pawnee arrived, it was over. Big Axe clapped him on the shoulder, his face beaming with pride. Big Soldier, who had taught him so much, now took the scalps of the dead Kanza and called Hugh brother and great warrior. His training was complete. He was one of them. He watched, still in shock, as the Pawnee women descended on the bodies, their knives flashing as they began the ritual mutilation of their enemies. A part of him recoiled, a ghost of his old self, but he said nothing. This was their way. This was now his way. He left the scene and sought out Little Feather. She ran to him, her eyes scanning him for wounds. Seeing he was unharmed, she let out a long breath and began fussing over a small tear in his shirt. He stopped her by pulling her close. She looked up at him, and then she kissed him, not like a Pawnee woman, but with the unrestrained passion of a white woman. In that moment, their 2 worlds became one. They turned and walked together, disappearing into the tall prairie grass that bordered the village. Nearly 3 years passed. Hugh Glass, now 42, was no longer a guest, a captive, or even an adopted son. He was simply Pawnee. He had mastered the art of tracking, learning to see the world with the soft eyes Big Axe had taught him, and his skill with a rifle and tomahawk was respected. He had found a surprising contentment in this life, a happiness that had eluded him in the so-called civilized world. The Pawnee, he discovered, were a joyful people who loved humor and practical jokes, and their carefree spirit had smoothed the hard edges of his own soul. He was, for the first time in a long time, truly home. The tribe had fully accepted him, this strange white man sent by a dream, and he felt a sense of belonging that was as real and solid as the earth under his feet. That peace shattered as the tribe prepared for their seasonal move back to the permanent village to plant their crops. A dark mood had fallen over Little Feather. She told Hugh of a bad omen. An owl had stared at her from a branch before flying away into the twilight. More disturbing was her dream. In it, she saw Hugh on a great canoe on the sea, but he was not alone. With him was another tall white man with dark hair, marked by a peculiar white streak at the hairline. This man, she said, hated Hugh with a chilling intensity. Hugh felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had never once described Tom Halpern, the pirate from his past, to her. He tried to dismiss her fears with a bit of white man's magic, drawing 4 small crosses inside a circle in the mud. But as they began their journey, the wheel of a travois rolled directly over the drawing, erasing it completely. The omen was not so easily dismissed. The journey was slow, the sky growing heavier and darker each day with the promise of a massive storm. Their party made camp near a river that cut through a 20-foot deep gully. The water itself was only a few feet deep, an easy crossing. Big Soldier made the fateful call to get everyone across before settling in. Hugh, mounted on his horse Annie, crossed with no trouble. He was waiting on the far bank when a low rumble began to vibrate through the ground. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of the world coming apart. A 10-foot-high wall of churning brown water, carrying entire trees and debris, exploded around a bend upstream. A log dam, swollen by the rains in the hills, had burst. The flash flood hit the Pawnee in the gully with the force of a cannonade, sweeping away people, horses, and travois in an instant. Hugh saw Little Feather, her face a mask of shock, tossed into the raging torrent. He screamed her name and spurred his horse forward, but Lucky Hawk intercepted him, grabbing his reins and physically dragging him back from the edge. To go in after her was not a rescue, it was suicide. A second, smaller wave followed, and then there was only the roar of the water. For 11 days, Hugh and Lucky Hawk rode the length of that river, searching for any sign of the 12 people who had been taken. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no trace. Little Feather was gone, reclaimed by the violent, indifferent nature of the land that had once saved him. Hugh Glass had faced a sacrificial altar built by men and survived, but he was defeated by a wall of water that had no god and no prophecy. His life with the Pawnee was over. This was the end of one story, but it was the beginning of the legend. What happened next would make him immortal. If you think you know the story of Hugh Glass, subscribe. You don't know the half of it.